All right, so after a 5 week hiatus away from the track, Formula One finally returned back to Miami this past weekend. And honestly, we were given a lot within, I guess, those 5 weeks of being away. We got a fresh new set of upgrades across the grid for most of the teams, except for Aston Martin. Don't know if there's a little bit of irony in that, being that, they've been struggling a lot as of late. But overall, though, we did also see in the series a huge change in some of the rule sets going into the race weekend as well, amidst the ongoing controversy within the series. And well, let's just be real here. There's definitely a lot of critics on this last and most recent regulation cycle. And also, we are, we're just living in Kimi Antonelli's world at this point. So, and the dominance is continuing. 3 race weekends in a row for the young Italian. But hello, everyone, and welcome to this first episode of the Open Wheel FM podcast. My name is Nicholas Clay, and today I'm going to be catching you up on all of the updates from the cars that were brought this past weekend in Miami, as well as going over some of the information regarding some of the changes to the regulations themselves, as well as obviously talking about the race itself, the things that happened, some key points, and then answering a couple opinions that have kind of been swirling around a little bit, some of my takes on, where the pecking order kind of stands from all of this, and much more on this very first episode of the Open Wheel FM podcast. Super duper excited. This has been a long time coming. And yeah, I think, because it is the first episode of the podcast, I think it's important for me to at least introduce myself because, well, week in and week out, you'll probably be seeing this face. My name is Nicholas Clay. I am obviously a fan of open wheel racing and motorsport as a whole. This podcast is going to be covering all things Formula One, IndyCar, and Formula E, which is a little bit different, I think, for a lot of people. I will give Formula E its roses for sure, especially after the news of their Gen 4 car. It looks really, really sick, and the series continues to get more and more promising as time goes on. It's taken a little bit of maturity for it. I know that Formula One right now, and some of the comments that like Max Verstappen has made, calling Formula One basically Formula E, has kind of shed some more light onto Formula E, and I think it's a positive one. So I want to be able to give it its limelight, and it is an open wheel series. So I am an electrical engineering student right now as well, so maybe that also kind of plays a little bit into it. But I am still early on in my studies, but I hope that as I progress, as I learn more, as time goes on, maybe I can add some analysis of some of the things going on as, time goes on. And I learn more as I go and get more comfortable talking about some of the more technical things as well. So hopefully that addition will be worthwhile for you to continue to follow along on this podcast. And I guess following along on the podcast as a segue here, make sure that if you really do love what you're hearing from this podcast, make sure that you drop a follow or a subscription on whatever audio platform of you're listening to for this. The big players like Spotify and Apple Podcast will be, the hosting sites of, this podcast, the Open Wheel FM. But I'm also going to make sure that it branches out and goes to other ones as well. So wherever you're listening to this from, It'd be awesome if you love the content to follow along. And if there's anything that you think I need to work on as time goes on, please let me know, because I always want to improve this podcast moving forward, right? I mean, I want this to be the best open wheel motorsport podcast and the one that you choose to go to and spend your time with. But yeah, so with all of that in mind, I wanted to first start off. I have some notes here. So if I'm glancing over a little bit in the video portion, if you're listening to this on an audio only feed, which will be available as well, then you're probably not seeing me looking over at my, my little note screen here. Because let me tell you, coming into Miami this weekend, there was some pretty substantial changes. Now, I know that we have been away for 5 weeks from the Japanese Grand Prix, and there was, if I'm keeping it very generous here, the results from Suzuka this year were definitely not very favorable for the criticism that has been developing and building since the start of the 2026 season. And basically, we saw over that 5-week break, we saw team principals, CEOs of the power unit manufacturers, the FOM, the FIA, and also the drivers themselves kind of come together and really talk about some of the, I would say, necessary changes that the series actually needed moving forward. Because, we did see some pretty suspicious things happen on track in Suzuka. The one that was kind of painted more broadly and was very sensationalized for a couple weeks, at least, as content was very limited over the break, was the Colapinto and Oliver Bearman incident, where the speed delta between the two drivers changed exponentially, and almost instantaneous, a reaction of that multitude. And basically there was a collision, where Oliver basically made contact with the wall at a very high speed, was pretty banged up getting out of the car, and it kind of raised questions more so about the safety of the sport. But then it also began to question as drivers kind of came out and said their own things. Lando Norris coming out and saying that there was an instance with Lewis Hamilton where he didn't even really want to pass Lewis Hamilton, but based on how the configuration of the car and how, let's just say like the push to pass option, right, that they have to kind of help the overtake mode, kind of forced him to overtake in a position that he didn't actually want to overtake in. So there was a lot of little intricate things that needed to change, and we kind of got a little bit more clarity of that. There was an agreement after a couple weeks discussion from that. So these were kind of the big overarching changes that happened from this. So the first one, and I'm going to kind of group these up so that it's a little bit digestible, especially if you're listening to this in an audio format. But there was some major adjustments to energy management parameters. And before I go on from this, you can actually go and look at the official FIA website. They have like a whole article that I will be putting the link to. So you can actually read, where I got this information on the technical side of it, more specifically. But it was a reduction of the maximum permitted recharge from 8 megajoules to 7 megajoules. And this specific change is quite substantial because it wanted the goal was to reduce the excessive harvesting and encourage like more flat out racing, right? So basically drivers were not, and this is kind of, I guess, the bigger picture. Drivers felt like there was moments where even though they were super clipping and they were harvesting, there was way too much harvesting going on throughout a lap. And that's kind of where you saw, and this is where the changes really came, was that the teams, the manufacturers, the FIA, they decided that they wanted to change the peak super clip power from 350 kilowatts. That's what they wanted to increase it to, from an original 250 kilowatts. So reducing time and the recharging time, basically the time spent recharging would be a lot less, but the recharge itself would be a lot more potent, which meant that as you know they're using this energy to go full on all out, in those moments where they are recharging, the recharge is a lot bigger. And even though the super clipping itself is, a little bit greater in its own case, it kind of brings in the cars into a window that they can operate in. I don't know if that entirely makes sense. I guess I'll try and reword this a little bit differently. So one of the things that the FIA, the FOM, and all of them, they really wanted to address was they wanted the cars to hit harder, they wanted the cars to recover quicker, and they wanted the racing to feel more flat out. And so in doing so, rather than like tiptoeing around and trying to fill the battery back up, because the issue before was, they were trying to, there was instances where the cars were harvesting way too much. And this meant like long, inefficient coasting phases to try and refill the battery because the battery was depleting so quickly. The changes are meant to affect not only the deployment to be higher, but the harvesting to also be higher as well. And so it encourages, and seemingly on the surface, right, we're not getting away from the super clipping. They may super clip more, but the racing spectacle should be a little bit better. And I think we saw inklings of that in Miami. Basically they deploy the energy, they recover a smaller amount of energy really, really quickly, and then they can deploy that energy. And so the car is staying in a sweet spot of the power curve more consistently throughout a lap. Whereas before it was, they use up all of them, all the power, all the energy, and then, the cars are starved. And so as they go throughout the lap, they're basically spending the lap harvesting until they have the next opportunity to then use everything up again. And it's to kind of reduce the two extremes, is where that kind of comes through. There was a little bit of revision towards race safety overall, and this addressment was specifically for the Colapinto and Berriman incident that happened with that speed delta, the closing speed between two drivers within the overtake the overtake zone, right? I'll just call it that. So basically, there's a maximum cap that in a race situation that the boost is able to basically activate, and it's 150 kilowatts. The MGU-K, which has also been a hotly debated component in, I would say, the modern Formula One landscape, the deployment of that is maintained now at 350 kilowatts in acceleration zones, but is limited to 250 kilowatts in other parts of the lap. And really, these measures are to tackle and reduce excessive closing speeds while maintaining the overtaking opportunities and overall performance characteristics. Now, this is really interesting because I did see something on social media. There was that incident with Leclerc, which I'll talk about as we talk about the race itself. But basically, Leclerc loses his position to Oscar Piastri, but Piastri basically didn't really get anything from the boost. And so there's definitely some things, and I'll talk about that. I don't want to go too much in detail for this section, but there's definitely some interesting things that I still think they need to work out. In terms of that boost being available for drivers, being able to give incentive to passing, especially as they are looking to tone down the electrical side of the car. It was still prominent, and in that one instance, it was pretty significant because you're racing for a podium position. So, and then there was some changes to the start. It was kind of minor, but basically, like, if a car isn't able to get off the line as quickly, there's like a minimum delta that the car will automatically initiate to kind of help, so that the car doesn't technically like stall and cause an issue like it did in the first race between Liam Lawson and Franco Colapinto. So I'm gonna take a drink real quick. Okay, so this next section I really wanted to segue into was the actual part upgrades. So in addition to the regulations and the modification to certain things about it, helping those cars stay in the necessary window of performance to kind of allow the spectacle of, the race to be a lot better. Within those 5 weeks, teams, had substantial time since they were away from the track to continue to develop and also bring what is probably the biggest part package so far this year for most teams. I did want to preface that out of all the teams that were bringing upgrades to Miami this past weekend, Aston did not bring any upgrades, and the Mercedes upgrade, while their rivals brought upgrades like Red Bull, McLaren, and Ferrari, Mercedes made an announcement that they would be bringing their package not this past weekend in Miami, but in a couple weeks' time in Canada. So, as you will find as I'm reading over the list of some of the parts that the teams brought, don't be surprised if I'm not really mentioning those as well. And also, Haas didn't really bring anything too substantial for this. They did bring in like a front brake drum, but nothing like super duper crazy. So, but I did just want to put that in there so that, I want to represent all teams, right? And I want to be impartial. So, but there was also something that I did like this change, and I want to talk about it. So because of the postponement of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, and basically I don't see those races coming back on the calendar, which is also something that is kind of transpiring in real time right now. Like, are they going to be able to race in the Middle East at all? I don't know. So I'll just call it a postponement. But I really like what the FIA did, right, with these teams bringing in such substantial packages this past weekend. They did extend FP1. So Miami being a sprint weekend, specifically for those who haven't really followed, recently or are new to the sport, the tracks designated for sprint weekends, they only get one practice session. And that one practice session is strictly 60 minutes long. And so that's not really a whole lot of time, specifically for teams bringing such major upgrades, to really have enough ample time to set their cars up in race trim or in qualifying trim, right? And so the FIA decided for this race weekend that they would extend the standard 60-minute to a 90-minute, which I think was very generous, very gracious, and I think was very necessary, specifically with all of this in a new regulation. There's just a lot going on. And so I think it's very good for these teams to have additional time to sort their cars out, specifically for this weekend and the circumstances that had, presented itself in these circumstances. So basically, McLaren brought a bunch of upgrades this weekend. And, last year, or actually 2 years ago, pardon me, in 2024, when McLaren brought their MCL 38 package, and it kind of changed everything. It happened in Miami. So the Miami upgrades in recent time, in the last couple of years, have been very good for McLaren. And as we will see as we talk about the race, they nailed it this weekend with taking a step forward. So McLaren brought a revised front wing and rear wing, modified bodywork, a new floor, extra cooling, and they also, for the rear wing, they brought a completely new design for that. So a lot there going on. Red Bull actually had a tremendous overhaul with their current iteration of the car. So they changed the side pods. They brought in a new front wing and rear wing, including the Ferrari style rotating element. Their take on it, it kind of opened up. There was a little bit more of a gap. That was a little bit different of the take on this. I think some people were calling it like the rotisserie ring, the rotisserie wing. There was front wheel bodywork done, engine cover bodywork, rear suspension alterations, and rear wheel body changes to the car. So really just a complete overhaul. I did also want to preface, so the team Red Bull, as they were, they brought a lot into this. One of the most important parts of the cars in the last couple years, but I would say this year is also very important, is that floor, and changes to the floor and the reasoning behind why teams are doing that. Red Bull as a team said that the revised bib geometry accommodates changes to the forward floor structure, then blends with the side pods to meet the engine cover, extracting more load while maintaining the downstream flow of stability. So I just thought it was very interesting how they're basically saying that this entire new alteration of the car, how it flows, how it works. And actually, if I'm being honest, it worked a lot. Like, I think they took a really good step forward. I think that the chassis side of that Red Bull is to be desired. But the powertrain is excellent in the car. They've produced a really good car. There's just some things that need to happen on the actual design of the car that, unfortunately, I don't really think they're going to be able to address too much this year. That might be something that they have to solve for 2027. But for a team coming in with a new power unit, manufacturing unit, with Ford powertrains, they've definitely surprised me. And I think this weekend they took a huge step with these upgrades. Now, a team that did not, I wouldn't say that, because of what they actually need as a team, right? It seems like they took a step back, and that's Ferrari, which is really painful to say. But it's not that they took a step back. I think that they did improve a lot on the design of the car, the aero of the car, and everything kind of coming together. Ferrari's glaring issue is the actual, they need assistance from the ADUO. That is what they need to be up there with Mercedes. It's not their aero package. I think they have the best package in the entire field. So these are just very good upgrades. It's just, unfortunately, the power unit itself definitely struggles in the straights, unlike the Mercedes engine or the Ford powertrains engine on that Red Bull. So it's just really hard to compete when you don't have raw power, especially in a a regulation cycle where power is king. But Ferrari brought a total of 11 upgrades. They were the most to bring in this weekend. They upgraded their front wing end plates, the front suspension, floor, diffuser, rear suspension, and in addition, they made improvements to their rear wing with a focus on increasing load in quartering mode while maximizing aerodynamic drag shedding in the straight mode, which is what I just hinted at, something that they've struggled with. Um, Williams, Williams, I think besides McLaren this weekend, in terms of upgrades coming in, making a humongous change, a humongous step forward, even the team noting that they were not expecting how well they did, I think that the Williams upgrade has worked out really well for them. There was reports that the Williams car was somewhere within the range of like 20 kilos over the minimum weight requirement. And so obviously shedding off that weight is going to give you tremendous gains around a lap. Obviously, you know, you're not lugging around and carrying all that weight lap over lap. You know, it kind of helps the tires and the longevity of those as well. Just a lot of upgrades. And so basically what they were bringing in this last package was really just addressing those necessary areas, trying to shed weight where they can, and really just bringing a comprehensive package. I mean, for a team that is being represented by a Mercedes engine, they have definitely been the most, but I think besides Aston Martin, in my opinion, has been the most disappointing, I think, especially coming off of the successes that they did last year. So Williams, you know, they brought a package addressing areas like their floor, side pods, bodywork, including the likes of their engine cover, their coke, and cooling exits. There was some changes to their tailpipe bracket and rear brace wing. Racing Bulls also brought in with a pretty snazzy livery. I definitely love yellow liveries on cars, just because we don't really get a whole lot of yellow in the sport anymore. It'd be really cool if a team joined Formula One and said, you know what, we're going with yellow. But anyways, Racing Bulls, pardon me, the sister team, had a really cool yellow livery that they brought to the race. But I digress. They made changes to their rear suspension, floor, brake duct, front and rear wings, and the rear wing end plates. It's so hard to say rear wing. Rear wing. I'm gonna work on it. I'm gonna work on it. Gotta say it 5 times fast, right? Now, the other team that has been surprisingly, at least I think, in my opinion, the most improved car from last year by a long shot is the Alpine car. Now rocking the Mercedes engine, no longer have that Renault inside of their car. I mean, they've done wonderful. I think that they've positioned themselves a step ahead of most of the midfield teams, if not all the midfield teams, and have comfortably kind of secured themselves like that 5th place spot. And have also brought it to Red Bull within the first couple races as well. So that Alpine car has been working really, really well. So, you know, them bringing upgrades, it actually looked like those upgrades, you know, were able to compete. I think Red Bull, I mean, having Max on your team is I mean, that's max, right? But I do think that they are still a step above the likes of your Audi, your Racing Bulls, obviously your Cadillac, your Williams, um, your Haas. I think that they're above those teams right now in terms of what they're able to do consistently week in and week out. Um, and I think a lot of that is in part they have a very solid aero package, and they're also with a Mercedes power unit. So I think those things combined have worked wonders for them so far. But Alpine, brought upgrades to their rear suspension, rear wing, the rear wing end plates. They also added a rear impact structure, which I thought was kind of interesting. That was designed to increase aerodynamic load locally and efficiently through the operating range of the car. So one of the issues that Alpine has kind of suffered with is that load on their car. It's been a little bit on ice, uh, and there's been some difficult operating windows for that car. Thankfully, the car itself is really forgiving and has been driven really well by both drivers individually throughout this season so far. But this was to help cover up that weakness on that car and kind of allow it to be even more consistent, even in positions where, it's not the best car on track. It can still hold its own in race, in race impact, specifically around those high speed corners. But yeah. And then lastly was Cadillac. Cadillac bringing the second largest upgrade package with 9 in total into this weekend. The team being so new, there's a lot of steps they have to do. I don't expect them to be at the front runners anytime soon, but basically this was a well-needed package. The team based in the United States, this is their first Grand Prix in the United States. They had their giant overhead that said Cadillac around the track. So they're definitely embracing that and, saying we are America's team. They brought an upgrade targeting their front wing, the front wing end plates of their car, their mirrors, which, if you don't remember, I think it was in China, there was that scene where I think Checo was driving and it just seemed like his whole car just ripped off. So they wanted to touch up and make that car a lot more sturdy and obviously, the safety of the car as well. Changes to the floor, the diffuser, the rear suspension, and the exhaust tailpipe bracket were some notable ones that the team wrote about. And also, if you're curious about seeing any of the the upgrades, changes to parts, the FIA also has kind of documented all of that. And I will, be leaving a link to where you can find those documents. And you could find the one specific for Miami and any future race, right? If you're a fan out there and you want to see, what did your team bring this weekend? Or if you wanted to see, what teams were doing or changing, definitely look at that because as I've been following along in the series, I've, and over the years in motorsport, it's been kind of cool to see, I guess, the transparency of what these teams bring week in and week out and really seeing if you looked back at Miami in 2024, you could see exactly what McLaren brought to bring them up to that front running domination of a team, throughout the second half of 2024 and well into 2025. And I also wanted to touch upon before we go into talking about the race itself, it was confirmed over the break that the Turkish Grand Prix would be coming back to the Formula One calendar in 2027. They secured a 5-year deal through 2031. So what this means is that we will get both Portimao and Istanbul Park on the calendar in 2027. Istanbul Park, we haven't seen since 2021 when Valtteri Bottas won the race in the rain. Has delivered some pretty good racing, I would say. Um, and you can't forget about the famous left-hand turn that is pretty synonymous with the track at this point. It's going to be really interesting to see how this new iteration of car is able to handle that. I think, teams will get a better grasp. There'll be some changes. Obviously, the megajoule, changes race per race. Will definitely be a race to race basis. But it'll be interesting to see. I'm super excited. I always love going to new tracks that we haven't seen in a while. And basically, the Turkish Grand Prix will be replacing Zandvoort, which is going to be gone after this year. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I'm excited for that. I'm excited, like I said, for a different track, right? It's always fun, and I mean, it's not really a track that we've never been to before, but it's definitely cool to go back to some of the tracks that have kind of been off the calendar for a couple years, for sure. Istanbul Park has kind of delivered a lot of really good races. Felipe Massa, he won 3 Turkish Grand Prix in a row between 2006 through 2008. And it's also a track that's also brought in a lot of highlight moments or, controversial ones at that. I recall the Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber collision in 2010. As the teams were having those inter-team battles between them, trying to do that. I remember that very specifically, seeing that clip go around quite a bit. But yeah, super excited. I just felt like I needed to put that in here because, I mean, it's breaking news, leading up to the race. And moving on from that, we're going to kind of go into my thoughts on the race as well. If you like what you were hearing again on the podcast, make sure to like, follow. It means a lot, and hopefully, at least some of the information I've talked about has been hopefully informational, something that you can definitely listen to overall. So starting off the race weekend with the teams coming in, the upgrades, we didn't know what the pecking order was going to look like. We knew that the McLaren car in the last couple of years have been, very dominant, have been pretty strong in race trim. And we saw that in the sprint itself with Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri securing a 1-2. Lando Norris qualifying on pole, able to secure that for himself. Oscar having a really good drive. Kimi, falling down the order a little bit. Mercedes looked on the back foot going into qualifying. A really good result for the Papaya team, going into qualifying itself. Now, Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull, they were able to make some necessary changes to compete with, the McLaren car, going into qualifying on Saturday. Kimi ends up putting it on pole for the 3rd straight race in a row, and an opportunity to, not only secure his first 3 Grand Prix poles of his career, but would then have an opportunity to win from pole his first 3 poles, his first 3 races of his career. In a season that I think a lot of people thought that George was the favorite to win. And there's a lot of parallels that you can make between last season with McLaren, right? Lando was the favorite. Oscar started off super duper hot. And then, as the season progressed, Lando kind of found his form a little bit. But Kimi on pole was a feel good story, basically continuing to make history for himself within the sport, being only 19 years old. Is just absolutely mind boggling to me what he's been able to do in just his second season on the grid. Max Verstappen qualified P2 on the front row, showing that the changes to the Red Bull within that operating window that they've been able to find, able to fine tune it in the qualifying suit. Max able to work wonders, able to get, on the front row alongside Kimi. There was a lot of hype going into that, right? I think Max has had a very tumultuous start to the season. Able to do that was huge, a huge sigh of relief for Red Bull fans, as there has been talks that Max may consider leaving. He may not. With qualifying performances like that and in a car that can compete, who knows? Maybe Max will stay around. And then Leclerc on third to start the grid. Pretty good from him. We know that the Ferrari is really, really good at its starts. So the further up that he is, I think the better that Ferrari is going to be. And then right next to him was Lando Norris in P4. We did see George Russell qualify P5, Lewis Hamilton P6, and Oscar Piastri was P7. So as the cars lined up in their formation lap, Isaac Hadjar started in the pits. There was a situation with his car. He was penalized for that, and so he started from the pit lane to start the race. The lights tick down. Everyone awaits the moment. It's been 5 weeks, right? And right off the go, Kimi Antonelli with a slow start, which has kind of been synonymous with his starts. He's even been, open about that. A slow start, and obviously the Ferrari being so good off the start. Leclerc is able to lead at the start of the race. Going into turn one, both Kimi and Max lock up. That gives Leclerc the opportunity to. Max on the throttle, dips his wheel into the corner after the first turn and basically does this pirouette 360. You can see the clips for it. It's absolutely insane car control for him to be able to maintain that, by the way. And Max goes from P2 all the way down into P8. Kimi is able to stabilize and maintains his P2 spot. And then Lando Norris, who kind of, if you watch his viewpoint through all of this, right, Max, kind of pushes him off towards the right to kind of defend. And then, Lando, from his viewpoint on his camera, you can just see the two lockups. It's kind of crazy, actually. There's a lot going on. But Norris moves up into P3. And then Oscar, who had a very good start, moves up into fifth place behind George Russell, who is in P4. I did make a note, because I do write notes during the race. There was a pretty good movement from Alex Albon up 5 places, and it looked like actually the Williams were in contention at that point to be fighting for the last couple places for points of the future race, which was huge, specifically for that team as a whole. So as all the craziness kind of dispels within the first couple laps, we see that on lap 4, Isaac Hadjar clips the wall going into the chicane and is taken out of the race. There's a lot of frustration from him on the wheel. We've seen it so much with Isaac. We also know that Isaac has also he's in a tough spot, right? Red Bull brings these upgrades. Max is looking very good on them. And then it's not Isaac, it's Isaac. Isaac unable to really he's unable to get comfortable with the car and is taken out of the race as well. It was a really tough weekend for him, and I don't know. There is going to be criticism, and I don't think it's warranted in his current position. I think that as he's trying to figure out, as everyone else is, he just needs to give himself a little bit of grace, right? I mean, I know that it's stress induced. There's a lot of things going on. But Isaac, if you're listening to this, man, just I understand there's a lot of pressure to perform, but it'll come. It'll come. I believe it. I think it will. It was just really unfortunate, where he clipped it. As you're racing in the moment, it was not even, it was probably a couple centimeters away from in the clear, just took it too sharp and paid the consequence for that. And then throughout the lap itself, going into the final hairpin, we did see an incident regarding Liam Lawson and Gasly. We get the yellow flags and Max Verstappen pits. Now, Max pitting basically created for us spectators, commentators, and the paddock as a whole that they were probably, because of how the strategy was going to be, it was going to be a one stop unless weather, which was also kind of a factor in the race, whether or not that was actually going to be whether or not that was going to be a factor. But Max pitting under safety car basically decided that he wanted to go long on the hard tires. So everyone on the field basically started on mediums. Max getting on those hard tires early on, as he had lost places before, wanted to make up those places, felt like if he could nurse the hard tires, he could at least make up enough positions and places that if there was a safety car as the other drivers pitted, then he could take advantage of that pit stop. It never came to fruition, but the team itself was kind of thinking about that strategically as a whole. There was an incident in the earlier lap between Franco Colapinto and Lewis Hamilton, which kind of ruined, I think, any chance of Lewis really climbing up the ladder. There was some issue that kind of affected his downforce and performance of his car, which was just really unfortunate. The stewards deemed the incident a racing incident, which they also deemed after the race. Both the Liam Lawson and Pierre Gasly was also a racing incident between them. The reasoning also that Liam Lawson claimed that he had a gearbox issue. It was kind of a crazy flip, by the way. I looked at it, and it was kind of insane, but basically got up and under the wheel. Gasly's car got up, or not up and under the wheel, but got up and over the wheel, and it kind of flipped his whole car. It was crazy. Everyone was okay. There was no penalties given out to either of those instances. Now, as the race kind of restarts, Piastri, able to, on the restart, able to pass George Russell. Russell would then eventually undercut the McLaren, which was a common thing that happened. But it just seemed like George was just not able to do and work the wonders and magic that Kimi was able to throughout this race weekend. It's just, whatever is going on, whatever, unfortunate issues that have happened and plagued George over the last couple weekends. He just needs to he needs to go back to the drawing board and figure out how Kimi is able to do the things that he's able to do. And I think one of the issues also that's been a pain point for Russell is the safety car restarts. I think he's been, unfortunately, one of the victims of that happening. He did say that there was an issue with his mode on his car, where it just didn't activate, and that's kind of where the inconsistencies of these cars kind of are right now. Whether or not all of that is truthful, or if that's the complete picture to it. He's also not the first driver to say like there's just some very odd things going on in the cars sometimes where it's just very sporadic. But basically, Piastri in the McLaren just looked way more comfortable. The car in race pace looked, in my opinion, the best in race pace out of the entire field, including the Mercedes. If they had clean air and were out front, I mean, the McLarens were so good on their tires. It was insane. But I would say that the big thing, the big change in point, I would say, within this race was on lap 27, Kimi pits, both McLarens stay out, Norris pits the next one, and it wasn't a bad pit by McLaren by any stretch. But the outlap was just better from Kimi on those hards, right? As you're getting up to speed with those, it was just better. And, he was able to stay within the window. They usually say about 2 seconds is pretty good undercut window. As Norris kind of pushed away around the, third mark of the race, Kimi was able to maintain, and the team of Mercedes was able to initiate a very successful undercut, which basically put him, as Norris was leaving, right? Kimi was coming up, and Kimi was able to pass Lando. Lando trying to, get that heat in his tires, get it underneath him, just wasn't able to, at least stick with Kimi, and Kimi was able to then ultimately secure himself the position in front of Lando. Max was leading the race at this point. He wasn't really a factor too much going into, the end stretch of the race, as Kimi and Lando both made pretty easy work of him. He was already on significantly older tires than the other two drivers, which was to be expected. I did want to preface this, and I don't really know if it was talked about, but Kimi did something so good. And it was just also the positioning on track that he was able to get and pass Max on. It kind of forced Lando in a position where he could not pass Max. So Kimi was able to pass him in a slower part of the track where the overtake mode could not be initiated by Lando. Because of this, Kimi was able to kind of push out about a second of space in front. Lando had to wait till the end of the lap to then, to cleanly overtake Max, into the last hairpin going down, towards the starting straight of the lap. But I think that 1 second breathing window to allow, Kimi to kind of stay out in front was so pivotal, because had Lando, I feel like if Max was not, if he was able to maybe pass Max, or if Max wasn't there in the picture and both the drivers, had to pass him where they did, I think that it could have been a situation where the McLaren, may have been able to, stay within that window and that range of pressure. But I think Kimi was just able to stay just far enough. And I think that is really, I think, the key point in this race, where Kimi was just enough ahead and his car was just strong enough in the high speed sections that there was never really a chance for Lando to actually beat Kimi. And I think that that's also a testament to Kimi as a driver this last weekend. Toto, went on record and said that he believes that this probably was Kimi's most composed and best race of his career. And I think that I could make that argument and agree with that argument that he made, that this is probably by far Kimi's most composed race as a driver, especially being able to lose the position that he did, able to come back, and very well executed strategy by Mercedes to give him that lead. And then through it all, right, as the lap went through, as it kind of progressed, him being able to maintain the pressure that Lando was putting on him as he's kind of navigating some issues with his downshifting. There was some instances where, he was concerned about the tires giving away from him. He was kind of reassured by his team that it was, it's just normal. They were overheating slightly, that he kind of needed to bring it down a little bit. But, overall, very well, like a very good race by a driver that has only had a driver in his second season and at his age, very mature, very well driven drive for him in Miami. We did see, as the race went through, Max kind of fell back behind both Oscar Piastri, Charles Leclerc, and George Russell at this point. There was some yo-yoing going on towards the second to last lap between, George Russell and Max Verstappen for that P5 spot. And then obviously Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri for that final podium spot. And that's kind of where everything kind of happened. Because there was a lot that happened, a lot of changes that really transpired at the end of the race. But the yo-yoing effect that we've seen the last couple of races on full display, it wasn't as pronounced, I would say. I think that there was some instances where there was some yo-yoing back and forth, but the opportunities that kind of gave themselves, and I think this is a track specific thing. Miami as a circuit is a very high power track with a couple significant straights that kind of allow for that overtaking to kind of go and take place. And then, the braking, the slower areas, allowing that now change that I mentioned earlier in the episode, allowing that harvesting to be a lot greater. We didn't really see too much of the yo-yoing, as much as we saw, the first couple races where like drivers would, pass each other back and forth like 6 times. We saw it maybe like 1 or 2, but really the driver that, was able to secure, usually on better, fresher tires, a, more favorable, advantageous position, was usually rewarded for that. But this is where I talked about something that I thought was really interesting, and it's probably going to be something that needs to be addressed. There's a video that I'm actually going to link from a YouTuber who kind of points this out, but there was an instance where in the second to last lap, Leclerc kind of loses it a little bit. And, Oscar is able to pass him, and then Leclerc basically is able to use the boost that he had previously because, he was able to, have that by being a second before. The boost that Oscar got wasn't, it wasn't worth anything. It's kind of hard to explain There's a video of it. I'll link it in this. But basically, Leclerc and Oscar fighting for this position on the final lap. I would say this is the most uncharacteristic lap I've ever seen from Charles Leclerc of his entire career. Very unorthodox. Uh, we know that there was some oversteer instances, but we saw a complete spin out. Leclerc collides, hits the left side of his car on the final lap of the race, and we see this damaged Ferrari. He's going off the track because he's trying to just keep the car on the track itself. Oscar, by this point, is well past him because of this, and he's well out in front. Oscar basically has the podium spot for himself now. Leclerc has this limping car. George Russell, 12 seconds behind him, is basically coming up rapid speed, going into the final straight on the backside. George able to make quick work of Leclerc, who basically has no speed at all, is just trying to get his car to the finish line. He drops it down, and Max Verstappen, who is battling with George Russell within the final corner of the race, is able to swoop around the outside and is able to claim that spot away from Charles Leclerc for P5. Leclerc falling down into P6, and that wasn't even the worst of it, as he suffered a 20-second penalty at the end of the race. The FIA deemed the penalty, saying that his car left the track on several occasions without a justifiable reason. And I'll read exactly what it says, because it's really interesting, and I could see where this argument is, right? If your car is damaged and you're leaving the track, and you can't keep the car on the track, cutting the track is not permissible because you're still cutting the track. So I get where this is going. But basically, it said, given the problem, he was forced to cut chicanes on the way to the checkered flag. We determined that the fact that he had cut the chicanes meant that he gained a lasting advantage by leaving the track in that manner. Regardless of whether his car was damaged, yeah, he basically cut like a whole corner of the track on the final lap, just trying to limp his car. Had George been further back, there could have been a world where he was still able to secure P4, so they deemed that a justifiable reason to penalize him. A 20-second penalty is kind of crazy, given the instances of what it was. I mean, he did lose 2 positions for it, but him losing 20 seconds of that meant that he ended the final, race, the race order in P8, which is absolutely insane. If you're almost guaranteed a P4 spot, you have an issue with your car, you're able to keep the car from hitting you hit the barrier, but, damage is still sustained. With everything that Ferrari has had to endure over the last couple years, the fans, the team as a whole, coming in with 11 upgrades and ending the final race, the positions of P6 and P8, as McLaren gets a double podium, Kimi Antonelli, able to just keep pushing Mercedes into the constructors battle, like into the forefront, right? The fact that Colapinto, because of that, was able to then he was able to secure himself a P7 finish in the race, basically handing him that P7 spot after. Franco had a great race, and I want to touch on that. It's insane. It's absolutely insane that is how the final lap was, and that's just how it transpired. It's just insane. Unlucky, yes. A warranted penalty, yes. 20 seconds, I don't know if 20 seconds was a warranted penalty, but anyways, it was just disastrous for Leclerc, who looked to be, yeah, he lost the podium spot, but he could have had P4. So, alrighty. So the last part of all of the Open Wheel FM episodes is going to be kind of a hot take, an opinion corner, usually about the race, maybe some, hot take opinions about what's kind of happened. Some things that people have been talking about, and really just getting like my take on some of this, and why I think, certain things, or why I believe certain things, or, what's happening. So this is kind of like the hot take opinion section. I'll probably come up with a better name for it, to be honest. But the first one I really want to address, and this was kind of the big elephant coming into Miami, was after the changes to the regulations. Is there a world where what we got this last weekend substantial enough to say, okay, and like take a step back and say, okay, these regulations, we can work with these, right? Like we can, weather out the storm for the next couple years, right? There's some promise that is being shown, right? Is there still maybe some changes that we do need to make throughout the season? Do we need a larger sample size, right? Or is all hope lost? And are these regulations just a complete disaster and drastic changes need to be made? Well, I did want to say this. Miami as a track, in my opinion, is a better suited track for these regulations. We haven't even seen the worst that these cars are going to have to endure. With that being said, and this is something that I think is important and is probably a saving grace for the FIA and Formula One as a whole, them not racing in Saudi Arabia, which is considered to be like the worst track for these cars to race around. Not after coming off of a horrible Suzuka performance, coming in, you obviously have these geopolitical conflicts happening. Not having that race is a godsend for the sport. Miami, fortunately, coming back 5 weeks, after the hiatus, is a very forgiving track for these. I will say that. Did the racing look better? I would say, that what they set out to do with the deltas, I think, was a step in the right direction in terms of like the closing speeds. As a spectacle of a sport, I don't love super clipping. I understand, right? Like energy harvesting and Formula E and like learning and appreciating that aspect of it. I understand. It's a little bit different when Miami as a track, I don't think was the issue. And I felt like there was advantages that could be made from the passes throughout. The first couple laps were very entertaining. We'll just have to wait and see. I think that the sample size as a whole is still relatively small, and we haven't really. I don't think that we've seen the worst yet that could come. Specifically, some of the races during the European leg, there might be some questionable things that may make us change the regulations even more just for 2026, right? There's already proposed changes after Spa. Um, so there's things that are in the works. I do think that the racing was a little bit more interesting. I do think that some of the instances, obviously the photo finish, right, where Max is able to pass Leclerc is good as a spectacle. Um, but uh, I don't know. I don't think we have really enough. I will say it is a positive direction. Um, you know, and I do like that there is a desire to want to make changes where they need to be. I guess that's kind of it, right? Like that's the open-endedness, right? There's still so much and there's just not enough, right? Had we had Bahrain and Saudi and then into Miami, right? Had we had those in that order, we would have had a larger sample size. We would have had the teams go to Saudi and seen potentially the disaster that could have been. Um, we'll just have to wait and see, I guess. I think Canada could be a good track as well, so I'm not really too concerned about that. There's a lot of braking zones, and with the enhanced harvesting as well, I think that's just only going to make the racing a little bit more. But I did want to say, though, like in that instance between Oscar and Leclerc, where Oscar initiates the boost, and the boost just narrowly passes Leclerc, who has more juice on his boost, to then boost past Piastri, who is then super clipping at an earlier point into the corner. Leclerc is kind of able to pass him. Oscar's like, why? Like, what's the point of me even making that pass in the first place? In that instance, right? There was no, like it sucked. Like it felt like there was nothing that I could do, and that the pass was just not even advantageous for me as a driver. Essentially, is what Oscar was proclaiming um, in that post race. And then the next one I wanted to talk about was Lando came out and said it was McLaren's race to lose. With the unfortunate undercut strategy, was this just how much further ahead Kimi is and the Mercedes and both of them coming together, just how good they are? Or are we starting to see inklings of Mercedes dominance and the team being a bit mortal? I got to take a sip of my Spindrift. Oh my goodness. I don't think I've talked this much in a long time. I got to work up to it a little bit. That's the problem with doing a solo cast podcast, right? You're talking the entire time. But I will say this in terms of the pecking order, I think that McLaren, out of all the teams, made the largest stride forward towards Mercedes. Given that Mercedes didn't bring any upgrades to this track, in overall race pace, I think that the McLaren looked stronger throughout the weekend. There was obviously issues that, George Russell, is continuing to struggle with. And obviously, right, like Kimi losing pole position, in a lot of the races, losing the lead that he builds up in his qualifying performance. As these teams get closer together, is that going to be potentially punishing for him as a driver? Because it's not always going to be that I feel like Mercedes is going to be peaks and bounds above all the other front-running teams, right? I think we're going to see that consolidation even throughout this season, as it seems like we have like 4 teams that could potentially win a feature race this year, even though Mercedes has been the only team that has like theoretically won every feature race. There's 5 different leaders in Miami. So I think that it was a very good strategy call from Mercedes. It was a well done undercut, right? There's a lot of things that the pit stops were, there wasn't really like, it was like point, it's like 0.6 of a second difference between the Mercedes and McLaren pit stop, between Lando's pit stop and Kimi's pit stop. Like, you're just playing with margins at that point. And could you have done a faster pit stop? Yes. But in hindsight, like, that's just a well executed undercut. Like, that's what makes that so good. And on a track like Miami that doesn't really have a strong undercut opportunity was even more impressive to me, in my opinion. Jolyon Palmer on the F1 broadcast, mentioned that, and that's a good point, right? Like, the fact that they were able to execute that was very good. And also Mercedes bringing their big upgrade package to Montreal in a couple weeks. We'll just have to wait and see, right? Are those upgrades that Mercedes bringing, is it going to continue to keep them ahead of McLaren? Or was it then that McLaren made such a big stride comparatively to Mercedes that now McLaren can bring the fight week in and week out? Same thing with, Red Bull and Ferrari, right? If Ferrari can get that engine change, mid-season, right, the ADUO, I mean, this could be a Ferrari that is winning races week in and week out, right? They just need that extra power. So was it Kimi's race to lose? I think that Kimi, with a well-executed undercut and with that Mercedes car and how well he drove, I think that that's a testament to him this past weekend. And I think that as he maintained his lead ahead, that it was really his race to lose, I think, at that point. And I think that that just shows the situation that we're in right now, where I think Kimi's dominance, his brilliance that he's showcased, his maturity as a driver, is really sticking it to some of these drivers that he's competing against. And that just makes it all in all, like, just that much more impressive. And, is George going to be able to step up to the plate? Or is someone else going to come up and challenge Kimi? Or is Kimi going to completely run away with this championship this year because he develops and builds such a big lead comparatively, right? That's also something to note, right? With Leclerc dropping down into P8, I mean, the gap between Kimi and Leclerc is even wider now than it was, before. And so the lead for the championship now is a very eerily similar situation that we might be seeing begin to develop that we saw in 2025, where Oscar, kind of brings out this massive lead and really takes charge of the championship in the early part of the season. And whether or not someone can fight Kimi for that, or if Kimi is going to be able to maintain the cool, calm, collected, driver that he's showcased so far, we'll just have to wait and see. I did also want to say, if McLaren is going to close the gap, Andrea Stella, the principal for McLaren, said in a press conference, at the same time, we plan on having a few more parts in Canada and some minor specific upgrades in Monaco and Spain. So the pipeline is full. So if you're a Papaya fan, I'd be very bullish, right? There's a lot to look forward to for that. And I'm just excited for F1 to be back, right? I mean, as much as people might diss or say like this season is absolutely cooked, it's just not even worth watching. me being a fan of motorsport, being a fan of, the technology that these cars build and make and develop, right, over time. I think that's what's always drawn me in to the sport as a whole, is the engineering, the design, the development that goes into making, the races become what they are, right? It may not be the most interesting race in terms of, the actual racing spectacle, right? Which is a disappointment. And maybe there's some artificialness that some people claim is just not, the way that Formula One should be done. But I still look at a lot of these cars and I say, the ingenuity and the technology in these things are still worth appreciating at the end of the day. And I think that that's what is so important through all of this, right? We can be loyalist and, not agree with the direction of it, but we can still appreciate, the technical marvel, at least for me as an engineer, or an aspiring engineer within this field to appreciate. So, yeah. And with that, I am proud to say that this was a very successful, and hopefully, hopefully you agree with that sentiment, as well as this is the closure to our first episode of the Open Wheel FM podcast. If you had a great time, I'll just reiterate it again. Make sure that you follow along, share this with your friends and family out there. I would love to make this the premier open wheel podcast for listeners, and kind of build a community, right? It's kind of been a goal of mine to meet people that have like interests, especially now, I think it's always great to have a community of people of like interest. Unfortunately, as we just got back from a break, we will be going on another break for the next couple weeks until, we get to Montreal. But with this being an open wheel podcast, I will be covering this upcoming weekend at the road course at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And then the following week, I'll be going over the Monaco GP for Formula E as well. So there's a lot of open wheel content, news, stuff going on to kind of, fill in the gaps and airtime for Formula One. So I encourage you to listen in and follow along with those as well. So I will be back next Tuesday. I know that the date of me posting this is off of Tuesday, but my goal is to have these videos out weekly every Tuesday for you to listen to at your enjoyment and leisure. So thank you guys so much for listening in. I'm super excited to delve into this journey on this podcast. And let me know what you think, right? If there was anything that you want me to change, or any feedback, I do like constructive criticism too. Like I said, I want to make this the best podcast, not just as a viewing spectacle, but something worthwhile for you guys to listen to. I mean, there's a lot of very competitive motorsport podcasts out there. So with that, thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll see you guys next week.